On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, it's What the Ship, top 5 news stories across the maritime sector. Hi, I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to this episode. If you're new to the channel, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, so we're looking at top 5 stories across the maritime spectrum. Been doing this now for over a year. Take about 30 minutes. We're going to run through the top 5 stories, a little bit of analysis at the end, and you are set to go for the week in what's going on with ocean shipping. And man, there's a lot going on. We're going to focus today on the oil and LNG sector and also on the container sector because there is just tons of stuff going on. So let's go ahead and jump over to story number 1. So story number 1 deals with the NordStream pipeline. These are 2 sets of twin pipelines that run from Russia in the Baltic. And as was reported the other week, there was a sabotage or accident done on the Nord Stream lines. Nord Stream 1, the twin pipelines of Nord Stream 1, both have ruptures in them. Nord Stream 2, one of the pipelines has ruptures in them. And countries have dispatched warships out there to see it. This is the natural gas kind of venting up to the surface. You can very easily tell where the leaks are. So this story talks about the fact that Sweden is sending out ships to investigate. There are Swedish, Danish, German, Norwegian vessels. Everybody in the world is out here trying to determine what caused the accident. Was this a blowout of the pipeline or was it sabotage? And we won't know till we get divers down there to take a look at it or ROVs down in the area to see it. And you can't get close to it while it's still venting because of the pressure. So everybody's waiting to find out what is the cause. There's a lot of suspicion. A lot of people are pointing fingers. See you there, Vladimir. But we don't know yet for sure. So we're waiting to see. In the meantime, what this is doing to natural gas imports into Europe and the market is a lot. So first off, the Russian Deputy Prime Minister says that the restoration of the Nord Stream pipeline is possible. The secondary line of Nord Stream 2, their twin pipelines, is undamaged as far as we know. In other words, it hasn't leaked. But Nord Stream 2 has never been turned on to pump natural gas at high volume. It's charged. It's ready to go. It was ready to start flowing. It just had never been turned on. And then in June, I believe it was, Putin turned off Nord Stream 1 for maintenance issues and has not turned it back on since then. Now, obviously, the European Union is in the midst of economic sanctions against Russia over their invasion of Ukraine. And so there's a lot of issues about using natural gas coming from Russia. Now, there's still natural gas coming into Europe from Russia. There's a pipeline that comes across Belarus. There's 2 pipelines that come across Ukraine, which is really weird. And then there's the Turkish pipeline. And we just found out that the Baltic line has opened up ahead of schedule to start pumping natural gas from the North Sea fields into Europe, but it pumps only a fraction, about a fifth of what Nord Stream 1 does, let alone once you would have brought Nord Stream 2 online. And what is basically happening here is that Europe is losing out on this Russian natural gas. Now, again, we're waiting to see what the decision is going to be made. But these stories over here from oil price, I think, are really interesting. We're going to talk to a story about U.S. and gas exports here in a second. But this story here on oil price, why the U.S. will not ban LNG exports by Josh Owens. The White House intends to keep LNG exports to Europe flowing through the winter. There is no we're not going to stop exports of LNG. Matter of fact, LNG has become one of the biggest exports from the United States. Once we started fracking the hell out of the United States in 2016, we are up to our ears in LNG. This has been a commodity that was never an issue prior to 2016, but once fracking started, we became absolutely overrun with LNG. And we have actually surpassed Qatar and Australia as the largest exporter. American LNG has been crucial in meeting demand in Europe, which is scrambling for gas supply and willing to pay for spot deliveries. Had lots of stories about this. The problem with LNG delivery from ship vice pipeline is you have to liquefy it, which means you have to cool it down to 260 degrees below Fahrenheit. I apologize. I'm an American. I don't do Celsius. So whatever that is in Celsius, I think it's minus 135, somewhere around there, but I may be wrong. Again, I apologize. Again, we're Americans. We just do things differently than everybody else on the planet. Heaven forbid we go to a system based on the number 10, because that's too complicated. We have to keep our own system. The liquefying of the gas and then the regasifying it when it arrives in Europe costs a lot of money. Plus, there's a finite number of LNG tankers, which we're going to talk about in a second. Finally, high demand in Europe, high natural gas prices, and increased export capacity made the United States the world's largest LNG exporter, which we mentioned. What's interesting here is that our biggest importer of LNG has historically been the Far East. Korea, Japan, and China. And one of the stories here that we see by Alex Kyman is this story. China is reselling U.S. LNG to Europe for big profits. The Wall Street Journal reports that just 19 LNG vessels from the U.S. docked in China in the first 8 months of the year, a far cry from the 133 recorded for last year's comparable period. China has imported nearly 30% more gas from Russia so far this year, typically at a steep discount, shipping data shows. So there's a couple of issues here. Number one is that enough to make up for what they're not getting from us? So China is getting gas from Russia via pipeline and a new pipeline they're trying to set up, plus LNG tankers. Is that enough to offset our gas, or is China also shifting over to other fuel sources, or did they have enough LNG stored, natural gas stored, that they didn't have to worry about importing it from the United States? Lots of stories there, a lot of subtext of what's going on in China. Are they just down in energy production because consumerism is down around the planet and they're not producing enough? A lot of subtext in this story to understand. And then finally, this story, which should have been the first story here. I'm not going to lie. This should have been what I started off with. But I wanted to end with it because it's such a crazy story. Greg Miller, LNG shipping rates shooting for the stars at $500,000 per day. Per day. $500,000 per day. Understand to build an LNG carrier, it's about $150 million in one of the subsidized yards in China or Korea. And you're talking about making $500,000 a day. Now, when Greg had a story a couple of weeks ago talking about $100,000 per day for charter rates, I thought that was nuts. But here he is writing this, and it is just crazy. On September 26th, Pareto analyst, sorry, I got to use my glasses for this, Eric Halvdinson, if you think my Chinese is bad and you think my other languages are bad, Norwegian is even worse, predicted that liquefied natural gas shipping rates could top $1 million per day in the fourth quarter. At least some deals are already halfway there. Paying $1 million may sound crazy, but it all comes down to the profit a shipper can make on its cargo. If a shipper can make $200 million in profit moving a single shipload of LNG, it will pay 6 figures a day of freight. And what we're seeing now is that Clarkson Securities put average voyages for most efficient LNG carriers at $313 per day as of Monday. Benchmark tri-fuel diesel engine carrier rates was assessed at $276,000 a day. It goes on here with the analyst from Clarkson. LNG carriers are shooting for the stars. Spot earnings have reached dizzying heights. According to brokers, owners can now achieve three-way economics, which means they are compensated not just for the regular round trip, but also for positioning voyages. As a result, earnings on a round-trip basis might be around $500,000 a day. Greg goes on here to talk more about it, and of course we'll have the whole news story there available in the show notes you can look at. But it all stems from the issues from the war, from Russia invading Ukraine, the cutback in Europe of natural gas coming from Russia, and now the damage to NordStream 1 and 2, and the fact that Europe is scrambling for its energy needs. Coming into the winter months, it's going to be interesting to see how Europe deals with this. They are trying to make differential with LNG coming from the United States, from around the world, and via other sources. But Nord Stream 1 and 2 had the potential to deliver a huge amount of liquefied natural gas to Europe on a consistent basis. And Europe had become overly dependent on it. They'd cut back on their own production platforms, particularly nuclear. They'd shut down a lot of their coal plants. And so they were using natural gas, wind, and solar. And now with natural gas being gone, Europe faces a tough problem. All right, let's jump over to another story about oil, story number 2. Story number 2, the White House reportedly weighing controversial gasoline export ban. So this is why the previous story had the mention of LNG will still be exported. It's because of this story right here. The Biden administration is thinking about curtailing gasoline exports out of the United States. Why, you say, Sal? Well, let's go to our favorite report, the EIA This Week in Petroleum. And This Week in Petroleum shows us the gasoline stocks on hand. And what you see here in this chart, it shows you the millions of barrels of U.S. gasoline stock. And in particularly, what you're looking at here is the gray is the 5-year average. That's how much gasoline stocks we have on average. And you'll see here that the yearly, or this year's weekly report, has us well below, in some cases, that area. And if you break it down into region, you'll see here that one of the areas we're seeing drops in right now is in the East Coast region. We see a kind of drop right there. And then in the Midwest region where we're seeing gasoline drop. And this has to do with the fact that gasoline is being exported out of the United States because brokers see an opportunity to make more money for their gasoline in other markets other than the United States. We've seen that all the time. They will pull gasoline out, distillate fuel, and sell it on the open market where there's a profit. I'm thinking of a tanker off Puerto Rico, for example, by BP as a recent example of that. And so this is creating a problem to fill this in. And the whole reason for this goes to another story at G Captain, this one by Barry Parker. I'm loving Barry Parker stories. I'm sorry. There's some great stories. Every now and then, G Captain, Splash 24/7, Freightways runs these really long pieces, which are great stuff. I love when they run these big features. And this one by Barry Parker is great. He talks about tanker trials and tribulations, longer voyages, secret trades, sanctions, and price caps. These are all the issues that are undercutting oil and gasoline shipments right now. First, longer voyages, ton miles. I've talked about this phrase, ton miles, for a long time. As gasoline has to travel longer distances, it naturally costs more, but the limited number of tankers you have take them out of the running. If, again, use the analogy, if you have a tanker that can do 6 runs a year, now all of a sudden has to go twice the distance, you're now down to 3 runs a year. That means you have got to increase your charter rate to cover the expenses for the 3 voyages you have lost. It becomes more expensive. Secret trades. We know, and I've been working on a feature, I just have not had the time to get it all together, but there's some great news out there about these illegal ship-to-ship transfers, taking Russian oil, putting it on other vessels, and then selling that oil without saying it's Russian oil. These are the ship-to-ship transfers that are taking place in the Atlantic, off in the Pacific. We see this happening all the time. And so these secret trades are a big issue here. And then the last one here are the sanctions and price caps. This is the effort by the G7 to try to curtail Russian oil without curtailing it. In other words, they want Russia to keep selling the oil because we have to keep selling their oil because we need their oil, but we don't want them to profit off of it and this way finance their war. And so the G7 has come up with a way to do that by basically limiting the price that the Russians can sell oil by limiting how much insurance they can get. And this story here, which is part of a Substack that is mentioned in Barry's piece, I should mention right here. Barry talks about it right here. Mr. Finley Richardson, who's a great follower on Twitter, has an entire Substack on this, talks about the misadvantages in shipping. It talks about oil exports out of Novorossiysk. Again, my Russian, terrible, which has been dominant. This is all the oil that is coming out of Russia from the port in the Black Sea, which is out of ports like in Kazakhstan, the Caspian Sea, and central Russia, and doing these ship-to-ship transfers. Great analysis. Really recommend you go over that Substack and read it along with Barry's piece. But the other one here, and this is also another one from oil price, here's how the U.S. wants to structure the Russian oil price cap. I don't think it's going to work. Let me be clear. I don't think the G7 can do this, largely because I think the Russians will either self-insure the cargo or they'll get insurance out of the 13 companies in the International P&I Club, and they'll go to China, they'll go to some other entity, or, like I said, they'll create one that will compete against them to get the insurance and therefore still be able to sail it. And the idea of then a cap on these oil prices, I don't think works. Plus, you have this issue right now that OPEC Plus just announced that they're curtailing production rates. One of these stories right here, this very first story, come down at the end of this story right here. They're talking about the fact that OPEC here they were talking about maybe doing a curtailment. Actually, maybe in this story right here, I think it's in Barry's story. I think Barry has at the end of the story. Yeah, right here, where word comes from OPEC Plus that it is now considering oil production cutback as much as 1 million barrels per day. They actually announced that it's 2 million barrels per day. So what we're seeing here is cutback in oil production, which means now there's going to be less oil out there on the marketplace, which makes Russian oil much more attractive. And especially because Russian oil is now going to markets that are not involved in sanctions at all. They're not in the G7 sanctions. They don't care about Russia, Ukraine. They just want their oil. And so Russia finds itself in a pretty good position to be exporting oil right now. And I'm not exactly sure the G7 sanctions are going to work against this in capping the cost of Russian oil. And what we're going to wind up with is having to maybe have government intervene and prevent the export of U.S. gasoline because we need it in this country, which is a crazy provision that we really don't see too often, with government requiring a domestic product remain in the United States. Just, again, strange times for everything. All right, let's jump over to story number 3. Story number 3 follows up on a story I did last week talking about rising water levels on the Mississippi River. If you get a chance, not just go watch that video, but go read the comments in it. I love my subscribers. I love the fact that I have people who operate and run towboats and barges on the Mississippi River who come in and give some great firsthand information on it. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. So it makes this channel great. I love the discourse, unlike some other channels I know who eliminate any comments that they don't like. I will usually, unless it's really insulting, leave everything up there for everybody to read. But this is great. I love when people help because, let me be clear, I'm never perfect on anything, as you'll find out here in a minute. But this story is really good. Mississippi River barge backlog swells as water levels shrink. This is a Reuters story on G-Captain, followed up with this story right here. Barge groundings create headaches on the lower Mississippi. This is from Maritime Executive. That kind of echoes that. And what we're seeing on marine traffic is that we're seeing vessels piling up here above Memphis, slowing down from Cairo to Memphis, and then a stretch here of the Mississippi River along the northern side of Mississippi here is really where we're seeing that happen. And it has a lot to do, as I found out in my video comments, because of drought in the Midwest, where the Missouri River and a lot of the western tributaries are not feeding into the Mississippi as they usually do. And this in turn is impacting cargo moving down. Come back to this story here, the Reuters story, the original one I had here, about 100 towboats hauling some 1,600 barges. I talked about the fact that on the upper Mississippi, you can have up to 15 barges on a towboat. But once you get down below St. Louis, you can have more because you don't have locks to worry about. So you can have even bigger sets of barges on there. About 100 towboats, 1,600 barges were lined up miles waiting to pass through one trouble spot near Lake Providence, Louisiana, had been largely closed since last week. At least 2 other sections of the lower Mississippi have also been closed, disrupting the flow of grain to U.S. U.S. Gulfport export terminals, where some 60% of U.S. corn, soybean, and wheat exports exit the country. The Army Corps of Engineers is dredging the river to deepen the shipping channel to allow some cargo to pass, but shippers fear that without substantial rain, the jam will persist well into the busiest grain export period of the year. Products such as road salt are also hauled north ahead of winter. And let's not forget, fertilizer has to get up north too, to be up there, to be put into the fields when planting happens, especially with winter wheat and spring crops. All this is happening in the backdrop that we're just now hitting 6 million tons of grain coming out of Ukraine, which is usually in a month, but it's taken several months to get it out, even with the Black Sea Grain Initiative. This has obvious impact in food production and food exports and food cost. And we're already seeing that with inflation and an economic recession on the horizon. And now we're seeing that with this. All this plays into an issue. And when you talk about global climate, again, whether you're a denier or not, it doesn't matter. Climate works in cycles, and we're in a cycle right now where we're seeing drought in this area, which is affecting it. Now, understand too, next year we could have massive rains, and that is also a negative because then you have levees bust, you have issues with getting barges down because of too much water. Again, river traffic is dependent on nature, and as we dammed and levied the Mississippi River, we changed the natural course of it, which means that we're dependent on a lot of factors. But this can affect you at home because you may see all of a sudden food prices changing or food getting more expensive or shortages of it in some ways. All right, let's go over to our next story. Story number 4, and this could have been story number 1, let's be clear about this, is the falling rate of container prices. And we're seeing container rates just fall off a cliff here. Now, everybody expected container rates to fall. I mean, they were at the highest they ever been. It doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure this out. The question has been how fast and when it would fall. And I'm going to do something that you don't hear a lot of people do, which I don't know why, because they're stupid not to do it, but I'll tell you something right now. I was wrong. I was wrong on a key piece of information. I was pretty adamant that we would not see freight rates fall back to pre-COVID levels. I assumed that the ocean carriers would do a lot to manipulate the rates by blank sailings, by restricting supply, and ensure that freight rates did not fall to that level. And I was in error, but I want to be clear about why I was in error. I believe I was in error, not because I was wrong in my assumption. I was wrong in my assumption that I thought the container companies would do something smart, and they didn't. They got greedy. And they never slowed it down early when they should have. They were just reaping the high rates, and they would rather get the higher rates than the lower rates. Let's go ahead and take a look at this story. So this is the Freightos index here for their basically composite. This is, if we come back up here, this is their composite global index. And you'll see right here, it's sitting at $4,060 right now. We're seeing other rates change. Northern Europe to North America is up 10%. Meanwhile, China, East Asia to North American West Coast is at 14%. And if you look at that rate right here, it's at 2,951. It has fallen below 3,000. Come over here, while the global index is not back at pre-COVID numbers, Craig Fuller over at Freightways posted this off his sonar data. This is showing the China to North American West. You see right here, it's at $25.15 and 83 cents. And if you come back over here to, when is this? He did October 1st of 2018. It was at $25.24. So it is below pre-COVID levels. But again, I want to caveat something here because yes, I'm wrong. I admit I was wrong. I did not expect it to go this. But there's some issues at play here that I think mitigate those factors. So number 1, I already talked about. I should, I'm an idiot. I should not have underestimated the greed of the big ocean carriers. I mean, they saw the money rolling in and they didn't want to curtail it, and they just wanted to keep the, do the Scrooge McDuck and dive into the huge vat of money. And that's what they did. But the other issue here is that this route is not the primary route for goods to get to the United States anymore. Remember, we showed this in a previous video. This is in June dropped below East and Gulf Coast combined, 49%. And it's going to be lower than that too. Most cargo coming from Asia now is not coming on the West Coast route. It's coming on the East and Gulf Coast route, meaning it's going through the Panama Canal. It's coming via the Suez Canal. And those rates are still pretty high. I mean, they're still up there. Those have not returned to pre-COVID rates. And so I think there's an offset in that too. And this has a lot to do with the reliability of LA, Long Beach, the West Coast. Go in here and some more stories that break this up. So this is where you get into the debate now. This is where you're seeing a lot of this. So this Mike Schuller story over G Captain, managed decline. Ocean carriers face challenge of keeping pandemic windfalls, Drury says. Drury, again, one of the big ones. I talked about this in a recent video on falling container rates. Drury is seeing this, and they're seeing that the ocean carriers are doing what they can, blank sailing, canceling sailings of ships, trying to limit the supply of spaces out there to limit it up. I had an interesting conversation with someone this week who's having a hard time getting a less than container load shipped across to from East Asia to the United States. Now, some operators are telling me that they're not having an issue with that, but others are. And this makes me wonder if ocean carriers and freight forwarders are really trying to prioritize full containers right now and don't really want to get into packing containers with multiple shippers' cargoes. Or they may just want to get these less than container loads to basically pay for a full container, which may be an option. This story from CNBC provoked a lot of interesting discussion on my Twitter feed. Lorianne LaRocco's story, ocean freight orders are signaling a big drop in consumer demand, but that's not jiving with everything else. Come over here, jump over to this story right here from Mike Schuller. Inflation concerns and high interest rates haven't stopped U.S. consumers from spending. And so we're seeing this issue. What's going on here? Is it consumer spending going down, or are they just shifting what they're buying? And I think that's the big issue. I think they're shifting what they're buying, and they're going from maybe higher value goods to lower value goods, but those lower value goods largely come from overseas. And so I think it's a change in the nature of the cargo coming across. Two other stories here to think about. Sam Chambers over at Splash 24/7, the specter of structural overcapacity looms large over liners. Just saw a report that came in and talking about all the new ship construction coming in over the next couple of years. But you have to remember, there's been almost no scrapping of vessels for the past 2 years, especially in the container ship market. That is going to change. You're going to see ships head for the scrap heap very quickly here. And that means that we're going to have overcapacity until you get rid of this. Plus, new IMO requirements are going to require slow steaming, changing vessels' propulsion, which is going to result in, I think, overall a reduction in the number of ships out there. But again, we just don't know, because obviously the ocean carriers invested in a lot of new capacity to get rid of their old capacity, which was getting dated and it was going to be expensive to operate. We'll have to see how this plays out. And then finally, Zentia, drop in ocean freight rates may be a normal market correction. We may just be heading back to where everything was. And basically what this tells you, and what it tells me, is we're just not sure yet. There's a lot of uncertainty in the freight market. All right, let's head to our last story. Our last story is a call out to all the viewers and subscribers of what's going on with shipping. So I am heading today, matter of fact, I'm going to head to the airport here in a few minutes, to the New York Maritime Security Conference, hosted by the Navy, the New York Council of the Navy League. It's taking place in New York City on Thursday, October 6th. And I was invited to attend. Matter of fact, I am going to speak at the event. I am one of the featured speakers, which is just crazy. Can I be clear? Because when you look at the speakers at this conference, how me, the host of a YouTube channel, can get to this. We're talking about Admiral Fagan, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, Admiral Jamie Fogo, the Dean for Maritime Strategy, one of 5 Maritime Commissioners, Carl Bensel, Beth Rooney, who I know, I went to school with Beth, the Port Director for the Port Authority of New York, the head of the 1st District of the Coast Guard is going to be there. Again, just the commander of the sector in New York is going to be there. And then me, associate professor of history at Campbell University and host of What's Going On with Shipping. I'm actually going to be on 2 separate panels. Pull panels up here for you. So I'm going to be a panelist on a discussion about fueling the force, Maritime's role in assured access to energy for the DoD. And then I'm going to be chairing a panel where I will have featured speakers talking about offshore wind, new regulatory and security challenges. I hope they'll be able to put these talks up online afterwards. And if they do, I will, of course, feature them and link them over to you. But I just want to thank all my subscribers, all my viewers. I mean, we're just past 59,000 subscribers, over 6 million views. It is this channel that has gotten a lot of recognition for the work I do, and I appreciate it. I'm not, I do a lot of work and research on this, and I write and do a lot, but this is largely due to you all, and I want to tell you how much I appreciate it. If you enjoyed today's video, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, give it a thumbs up, and if you can, support the page. The way you can do it is one of two ways. You can hit that super thanks button below where you can contribute directly to the page, or you can head over to Patreon. You'll see a link at the end of the video or down in the show notes. You can become a monthly or yearly subscriber to the channel. Any effort and any support goes a long way to me keeping this channel up and operating. So until our next video, this is Sal signing off.